Coming up next is Dr. Kimberly Taylor. You can listen live on the internet at drkimtaylorshow.com. Here now is Dr. Kimberly Taylor.
Today we're going to be talking about anxiety. What is the purpose of anxiety? We've all been fearful at times, and some more so than others. But rarely do we see fear as something that is protecting us. Believe it or not, fear is there to protect you. If you had no fear, you simply would not continue to survive. So, in other words, anxiety does have a purpose. And the purpose is to warn you of possible impending danger, and then to begin to initiate the physiological responses in your body that you will need should it be necessary to defend yourself or escape. You've heard of fight or flight, right? Well, anxiety is your body's way of warning you of a possible injury or loss that could happen, and it wants you to be prepared. So today, I want you to start thinking about your anxiety as a very elaborate, built-in warning system, letting you know that something may be wrong and you may be in danger. Now, it's going to be your job to check out your environment to determine if this danger is real or imagined. People often experience a general state of worry or fear before confronting something that's challenging, such as public speaking or taking a test, performing, or even going on a trip. And these feelings can be easily justified, and they are considered normal. But when you start to fear the feelings of fear, then this can start to become the problem. Feelings of anxiety often start in our bodies. And if we could tune into these early warning signs, then we could learn to deal with our fears in a very healthy and productive way. But when you're constantly trying to ignore the messages that your body is sending you, you can become uncomfortable in your own skin. And you start to run from the feeling of fear itself. So in essence, when you become afraid of being afraid, you will often end up in a full-blown panic attack. So the question is, how do we manage our feelings of anxiety? Well, I have a guest today. Her name is Dr. Lizabeth Roemer, and she has written a book called The Mindful Way Through Anxiety. And she's here today to teach us about a powerful way to manage our feelings of anxiety by sharing her expertise in this area. She's going to show us that by turning towards your anxiety and observing it in a whole new way, it will help you to learn to break free from the grip of anxiety and then be able to move forward towards the kind of life that you really want to live without being controlled by your fears. So first, what I want to do is to go through the different types of anxiety. The first one is generalized anxiety disorder. And this is a chronic worrying about a number of things. You just worry, worry, worry. And the people who suffer from this expect failure and disaster to the point that it interferes with their daily type of functioning. Then there's specific phobia. And this is an intense fear of a specific object or a situation, such as snakes, heights, or even flying. And so you tend to avoid the objects or the situations at all costs. The next one is panic disorder. And this is a type of anxiety that comes on with very sudden attacks of intense terror that strikes you and it leads you to feeling really shaky. You start to have chest pains. You can have a lot of confusion, even dizziness, nausea, and difficulty breathing. In fact, it feels like you're having a heart attack or that you're going crazy. Sometimes this kind of panic disorder can be accompanied by something called agoraphobia. And this is anxiety about being in places or situations from which escape would be difficult or even embarrassing, or in which you feel that help might not be available in the event of you having a panic attack. The next one I want to talk about is social anxiety. And this involves an overwhelming worry and self-consciousness in everyday social situations. The worry usually centers on a fear of being judged by others, or that you might behave in a way that might cause embarrassment or lead to others criticizing you. The next one is OCD. That's obsessive-compulsive disorder. This is characterized by thoughts or actions that are repetitive, distressing, and intrusive, but actually they serve to decrease a person's anxiety. People who suffer from OCD may obsessively clean items such as their hands, or they will constantly check locks or stoves or light switches. This is all in order to try to decrease the anxiety that they feel within. The next one is PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And this results after someone is exposed to trauma such as combat in the military. It can be a rape, it can be abuse, but it can also be if you're involved in a serious accident. What people generally feel in this is that they feel like they're very powerless and they feel like a victim. And it's the point to which they even start to have flashbacks and nightmares. Then the next one is separation anxiety disorder. And this is characterized by high levels of anxiety when they are separated from someone or some place that provides a feeling of security or safety. Now, there can be a lot of symptoms, and it really depends on the type of anxiety disorder that you have. But the general symptoms are going to be the feelings of unease, rapid heart rate, sweating, blushing, nightmares, problems sleeping, cold or sweaty hands or feet, a shortness of breath, dizziness, palpitations, a real hard time trying to stay still or be calm, a dry mouth, numbness or a tingling in the hands or feet. You can become nauseous and even have muscle tension. Currently, there is compelling evidence now that mindfulness can improve your ability to manage your anxiety. And today we are going to continue this conversation with my guest, Dr. Lizabeth Roemer. So if you have a question or if you would like to send an email, you can either call at 564-1290 or toll-free 866-564-1290 or email me at drkim@drkimtaylorshow.com. I'm going to be taking a quick break here, and then I'm going to be right back with my guest, and we're going to be talking about the mindful way through anxiety. There is compelling evidence right now that mindfulness can improve people's lives in dealing with their anxiety. In a new book called The Mindful Way Through Anxiety, Doctors Lizabeth Roemer and Susan Orsillo have created an engaging guide with very helpful exercises to help people who need to cope with their own anxiety. So I have with me Dr. Lizabeth Roemer, and I'd like to welcome you to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. Now, do you want to tell us just a bit about you? This is not your first book, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I am a clinical psychologist and a professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston. And this is my first book. This is my first self-help book that I've written with my colleague, Sue Orsillo. And before this, we wrote a book that was more of a guide for therapists.
Okay, but you have been doing research on anxiety for over 20 years, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. One of the things that I really liked in your book is that you describe anxiety as sings its siren song of protection, and that fear and anxiety are like a pair of overzealous bodyguards. So tell us what you mean by this, and what is the function of fear and anxiety?
Oh, sure. And thank you. I think it is my wonderful colleague, Sue, who had that excellent language that you picked out. But and one of the things that's really important to understand about fear and anxiety is that they really do serve a purpose in our lives. But what can happen is that they can kind of overserve that purpose. And that's what gets us stuck and starts to get in the way of our lives. So when we talk about that, anxiety has a siren song of protection, or sort of a bodyguard. It speaks to that function, which is to protect us. that because we experience fear and this ability to respond to any kind of threat immediately, and I heard you mentioning some of the symptoms before with our heart racing, getting ready to fight or to flee, this is a very adaptive thing if, in fact, a threat is coming towards us. However, what can happen is that we can detect threat or prepare for threat in the case of anxiety, which is more of an anticipatory response, when there actually isn't a threat there, or perhaps the threat isn't as large as we think it is. So in this way, our sort of natural system that keeps us safe can actually kind of overprotect us, leave us on edge or on guard, disengaged from our lives in this kind of overactive attempt to protect us.
So what is the difference between fear and anxiety?
Fear is the response that we have immediately to a threat. So, one way of thinking about it is if we imagine if we're crossing a street and suddenly we hear screeching brakes and a bus coming towards us, and we imagine what would happen in our bodies, that's fear. That immediate response to danger that gets us ready to run and jump out of the way. We don't think at all. We're just kind of acting. That's a fear response. And anxiety is more the anticipation. So it might be if we were imagining that we're going to cross a busy street and we started to think, what if something happens, or those kinds of things. Sometimes anxiety is also characterized by a lot of worry or thinking in our heads. What if this happens? What if this goes wrong? What if I'm late here? What if I do a bad job? So it's that kind of preparation for something bad happening in the future.
So the anxiety starts to become the fear of having the fear.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And the fear of something bad happening.
Okay. And people can constantly have this running in their head over and over and over again, and that's part of the problem, right?
Exactly, right. And like so many of our responses, it's learned. So, what happens is that the experiences that we have, either early on in our lives or even more recently, shape us. So we can essentially develop a habit of being afraid, and then in turn a habit of being anxious, of being always on guard. And because that anxiety, the natural thing that happens with both anxiety and fear is that we sort of retreat from life, right? Because again, if we were standing and a bus was coming towards us, running away from that would be exactly the right thing to do. So what fear tells us, or what anxiety tells us, is to hold back, to not go into danger. But if we get into this habit where we're having it all the time, then what's going to happen is we're going to hold back, and then we're not going to have experiences that say, well, actually, this part of life isn't quite as scary, or sometimes these things can go well. And so then it just gets stronger and stronger, and that's what can happen for so many of us, and then lead us to being really stuck in our lives.
A lot of people tend to try to suppress this and to avoid this, and when they do that, then they can't really learn to challenge themselves and to learn to grow past it too. Part of this, it does start in the body. So most people think of anxiety with only a few of the symptoms, but how does it actually operate, and how do we experience it within our body?
That's a great question, and you're right. There's a lot of different ways that we can experience anxiety in our body, and partly different people kind of develop a habit of experiencing it in different ways. So one way is the kind of, like I talked about, the more kind of panicky sensations like heart racing or palms sweating or feeling dizzy or lightheaded, or the kind of really strong arousal. Other times people experience it more, I think you mentioned earlier, like in their stomach, like feeling a lot of gastrointestinal distress or tension or upset. Another way can be really muscle tension or feeling on edge. So sometimes people don't experience the arousal parts of it as much, but see their shoulders are always tense and hurting. Almost like a bracing is one way of thinking about it. If you remember that anxiety is getting ready for a threat, well, if you had your body kind of tensed and ready, well, then all your muscles would hurt, right? And they'd be tense. So that's another way of feeling it in the body. And sometimes people don't feel it as much in their bodies as it shows up in their thoughts, in that kind of worry. And what if this happens?
And we can't just get over this kind of feeling. That, in fact, what we know is that trying to suppress it can actually cause it to be stronger and to last longer, right?
Exactly. And that's such an important point. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because the natural thing that everyone does, and, myself included, is if we're feeling these kinds of feelings, we want them to go away, right? They're very unpleasant in our bodies. They feel disruptive. They get in the way of the things we're trying to do. If we feel really anxious or on edge, or our mind is spinning, we feel like we can't speak as clearly or sort of engage in our lives. And so naturally, kind of the first step is to want to not be anxious. And in fact, people get that message all the time, right? So people tell us, don't worry, relax, and so that would just work,
Right.
And so it's very natural to try to get rid of it. And of course, sometimes we can lessen it, and there are some things we can do. But sort of the more we want to get rid of it, the more we feel like right now I need to not be anxious. In fact, the research suggests that we get more anxious. The more we try not to think of certain things, actually then we find ourselves thinking of them even more. The more we try to kind of get feelings out of our body, we actually find that they get stronger. And a lot of times, because people don't often talk about this, because again, these messages are more, it seems like everyone else is managing it. When you look at someone, you can't tell if they're anxious or not, right? So it kind of seems like we have all this anxiety in our bodies and everyone else seems to be doing just fine. And they say, just get over it. So it seems like for people, while they're trying not to feel these things and it's not working, it seems like it's something wrong with them. Like they should just try harder. But in fact, that's not the case. That it is really the case that we cannot just get rid of anxiety. It's a natural human response, and it will occur. It occurs for all of us. It certainly occurs for me.
Okay, so we need to find a way to see that it is productive, that it does serve a purpose. What do you mean when you say that we need to cultivate a new kind of awareness around anxiety?
So what we mean by that is that, so again, anxiety is this natural response and attention towards threat. And so often the way that we're aware of anxiety is in this really narrow, focused, critical way, right? Because one of the things that anxiety does is it kind of narrows us in on any potential threat. So then we notice just the anxiety we're experiencing. We don't notice anything else because the anxiety is a cue of a potential danger. And we are critical of it. We want to not feel it. We think it's bad. We often think anxiety is a sign of weakness. And so that kind of attention makes it worse. But in fact, there are ways, and mindfulness strategies is one way, to recognize that we're experiencing anxiety, sort of see it as it arises, but broaden our awareness so that we have our anxiety, but we also have other things. So for instance, I might, before I got on the air with you, I've had some thoughts, some experience with anxiety. I'm talking and I, want to say the right things and those kinds of things. But I can be aware of that feeling of anxiety, and I can also be aware that I really want to talk about this work because I want to be helpful to people, that I'm also excited at the opportunity, so to kind of broaden and expand my awareness. So I have anxiety, but I have other things as well. And also to be less critical of that anxiety, to recognize anxiety is just a natural experience if we do something new or something where perhaps we could be criticized or rejected, and that anxiety may arise, and that's okay. We can still do the things that matter to us even while we feel anxiety.
And you were saying that, most people try to struggle with trying not to feel it. You're saying that if we can shift to a more mindful way and to try to befriend it, that we are going to get along a lot better. So we are going to take a quick break. I'm here with Lizabeth Roemer. She's written the book called The Mindful Way Through Anxiety, and we're going to be right back to talk more about this. I'm Kimberly Taylor, and you're listening to KZSB AM 1290. I am back with our guest, Dr. Lizabeth Roemer. She has written the book along with her co-author, Susan Orsillo, but the book is called The Mindful Way Through Anxiety, and it's a great book. It has a lot of exercises and a way to start to understand anxiety that's going to help you get through it rather than continue to try to suppress it. So, could you talk to us a bit about this whole mindfulness, that it is a special type of awareness, but can you define how it is used in your book?
Sure. So exactly, mindfulness is it's a way of paying attention, and there are some specific aspects of it. It's paying attention on purpose, so with intentionality, and in the present moment, so paying attention to what's happening right now. And again, that's different than from anxiety, right, which is focused very often on the future, as I was saying earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then also paying attention. Sometimes people describe it as non-judgmental, or we often talk about it as with compassion or with kindness. And so that's a really important part of it. So often the kind of attention we pay, particularly to ourselves, is really critical. Why did I do that? Why did I think that? Why am I feeling this? This means something bad about me. And mindfulness is really about paying attention without that type of judgment, or when that judgment arises, instead cultivating a kind of compassion and care for ourselves and for others.
So as you say all of that, and you're asking us to actually think more about our fear, won't some people think that if they focus more on their anxiety, that it's just going to make it worse?
Yes, that is a conversation I've had many times with many people.
Me too.
Yeah. And absolutely. And in fact, I often tell people it actually will at first. It can feel worse because often, when people come to see me, they've spent a lot of time trying to get away from their anxiety. It hasn't worked, but it has perhaps made them a little less aware of how often they're anxious. And so when I start to practice mindfulness with them or have them begin to monitor their anxiety and kind of turn toward it instead of away from it, it's not at all uncommon for people to start off with, I'm more anxious than I thought I was, or this is really uncomfortable, or I think you're making me worse, Liz. What are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
If I wanted to pay more attention to my anxiety, I could do that on my own. Why am I coming to you? And again, these are really reasonable questions, and it does seem really paradoxical. At the same time, I think most people who have experienced anxiety at any level know that the thing is that turning away from it doesn't really work. And so it's worth trying something else. And what happens over time as we practice is that we can turn our attention towards it, and we do feel it more sometimes. But then over time, we start to notice things like that it rises and falls, that we don't feel it all the time, that it's maybe not quite as intense, or that we experience anxiety, but as I was saying before, maybe we're also experiencing excitement or pride or joy or love. And so in fact, as we kind of allow it to be there in this kind of paradoxical way, it ends up not taking center stage in quite the same ways that it does when our whole lives are about trying not to feel it, which again actually makes it kind of central.
Yes, and I think at this point that we really need to say more about, because when people try to suppress their fear, their anxiety, that something that started out to be self-protective and trying to help them, it actually turns into something that then starts to become overprotective by still trying to get more of your attention.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Right. So it's this. Right. It's a complicated thing. There's something about the anxiety that's been useful, but then it kind of builds and builds. And I think most of us who have experienced anxiety can relate to that idea that it can start to really feed on itself and essentially kind of spin more out of control. And as you said, really grab our attention in this more intense way, and then oddly, trying not to attend to it actually makes us pay attention to it more. Sometimes I think about it as if you imagine that you're trying to be on guard for something. So if you decide, like, all I'm going to do in life is not be anxious, well, how are you going to do that? You'll have to notice any sign of anxiety, right? Mm-hmm. And then try to get rid of it. So, now you're just on guard for anxiety, right? So, in fact, in this odd way, you've kind of turned your attention more towards your anxiety by totally committing yourself to getting rid of it. Whereas if, we practice instead this broader awareness where anxiety can come or go, and I don't have to watch out for it. It'll come. I'll know when it's there. I'll feel it, right? Anxiety makes itself really known to us. And I can see it and recognize it, but I don't have to be commanded by it. I don't have to do what it's telling me to do. And I don't have to, wrestle with it to get rid of it. I can just let it be there, and sometimes I will be anxious, and sometimes I'll be less anxious. And I think what many, many people find is that relating to it in this different way, even though it seems initially exactly what you said, like just the worst idea,
mm-hmm.
It turns out that, in fact, it does really change the nature of our anxiety. It changes its intensity, and it changes its duration, and it changes how much it disrupts our lives.
So if you are asking us to change our relationship with anxiety, how can mindfulness help us to manage our anxiety?
So, I mean, part of what mindfulness does is that it can really help us, again, to kind of put down that struggle. And what we end up finding when we really pay attention to our anxiety is that the struggle is a part of how the anxiety gets so intense. So when we aren't fighting with it, when we aren't as alarmed by it, when we're able to have some compassion for ourselves when we feel anxious, in fact, our anxiety, as I said, it doesn't sort of take us over quite as much, and it's also not as intense, and it's not as intrusive. And so that's how it helps us manage our anxiety. It doesn't make it go away, and that's really important. So sometimes I think people, understandably take on any of these strategies, like mindfulness strategies, and want to, like, clear their minds and, rest their bodies and have an anxiety-free existence. And that doesn't actually work. But what it does do is it makes it so that anxiety is not as disturbing, and it's not as long-lasting and as lingering.
You're saying that one of the parts of this is that mindfulness can help us to tolerate these uncomfortable feelings so that we can and that once we can do that, then we can learn from them. So tell us a little bit about how this works. How can we learn from our anxiety, and what are the things that we are needing to pick up?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Right. So it's exactly right. When we're sort of engaged in fighting it, that interferes with our awareness of what it might be telling us. And actually, I would expand it a little to say it's not just our anxiety that we can learn from, but it's actually all of our emotions. So a lot of times when I'm working with people who have been anxious for a long time, they aren't very aware of that sometimes their anxiety actually, for instance, follows anger or sadness. Perhaps there's been a loss, and then they experience a lot of anxiety. And so what can happen when we're able to relate differently and allow our anxiety to be there is sometimes we'll find there's something else underneath it. Perhaps someone has hurt us and we're angry. And so if we can see that, then that can help us to know, well, maybe I want to say something to that person. Maybe I want to tell them how I felt about that. Or if it's our anxiety is kind of covering up sadness, maybe we're afraid of our sadness. And there's research that shows that anxiety is tied to fear of a lot of emotions, sadness, anger, even positive emotions, that some people fear the kind of uncertainty of positive emotions or them being kind of taken away. So if we can relate differently to our anxiety, then we can actually have our full emotional experience. And those emotions sometimes tell us things that are important. They might tell us that we're dissatisfied with our work, and maybe we want to be looking to change our work in some way, or that there's a relationship that's unsatisfying and there's something we want to do about it. So our emotions can tell us things about what matters to us and help us to make choices that aren't just based on that self-protection we were talking about earlier, right? If all we have is anxiety and all we're doing is trying to get rid of it, then we aren't engaging in our lives. And that's the other piece of what Sue and I really try to highlight in the book, is that it's not just like, let's relate differently to our anxiety for fun. It's because let's be in our lives. Let's figure out how to do what matters to us. And sometimes while we do what matters to us, we will experience anxiety. But if we're able to relate differently to it, we can still notice the things that matter and do those things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I love that point that you just made, that we need to be in tune with all of our feelings, the good and the bad, because they are important for us to be able to access so that we have information that we need to know about people or events or ourselves. So we are going to come right back to this right after the break, and I'm going to have you demonstrate the mindfulness kind of breath work that you talk about in your book. I'm talking to Dr. Lizabeth Roemer. She has a book, and it's titled The Mindful Way Through Anxiety. We'll be right back. I'm Kimberly Taylor, and you're listening to KZSB AM 1290. I am here with Dr. Lizabeth Roemer. She has written a wonderful book called The Wonderful Way Through Anxiety. I do want to remind people that this program is rebroadcast Thursday evenings at 10 p.m. and Sundays at 9 a.m. if you would like to hear it then also. So you say that this is a skill that we already possess. So could you kind of show us or walk us through what mindfulness looks like and what that kind of exercise is?
Sure. And so I'll say a few things about practice before I lead through it, just kind of for a frame. So we talk a lot about sort of two ways of cultivating this practice, one being through formal exercises, which is kind of setting aside some time to practice this skill, which, as you said, is a skill we already possess, but often we don't use it a lot. So I sort of think of that as like training, so you can put it aside. And then the other kind of practice is more informal practice that we would do in our lives, which is really what we want to be doing. We want to be practicing being mindful while we're living our lives. But sort of to do that, sometimes it can be really helpful to set aside some time. So the exercise I'm going to do is the first kind of formal practice, because I think it's a helpful way to kind of get the experience. So and when I do this with people, I always first talk a little bit about how to sit. So it's helpful when we're practicing to be kind of sitting evenly. So if we're on a chair, uncrossing our legs and putting our feet on the ground, or if we're sitting down, crossing our legs in a way that's comfortable. Sometimes people have an idea that you have to be in some really uncomfortable position to do this. You really don't. The idea is not
standing on their head.
Discomfort. So, which includes for people who, if you are sitting on the ground, putting a lot of pillows under you is totally fine to kind of get yourself into a good position. So we talk a lot about that in the book. But if people want to just, as you're listening, get yourself comfortable, and you want to be sitting kind of upright. So almost like I like to imagine a string attached to the top of my head, so that just my spine is straight, shoulders lowered a little. And then either close your eyes or lower your eyes, whatever feels most comfortable. And beginning by just noticing the way you're sitting, noticing the way that your body feels in the position that you're in. And then allowing your awareness to settle on your breath. Noticing where you feel your breath in your body. It might be your belly, or your chest, back of your throat, or your nostrils. And just noticing what it feels like as you inhale and exhale. Noticing when your mind wanders, and each time just bringing it back again to that place where you feel your breath in your body as you inhale and exhale. As thoughts or sensations come and grab your attention, just again coming back to your breath. What it feels like to breathe in this moment. And allowing your awareness to come back to the way you're sitting. And opening or raising your eyes when you're ready.
So by doing this and having this kind of practice, what is it doing within your body to allow you to then tolerate the uncomfortable feelings?
So usually after I would do a practice like that, then I would talk to people about what they experienced. So it's a little odd to do it with people out there and not know what their experience was. But But one of the things I'll talk about a lot is what it's like to come back again and again. So what it's like to notice that you have the thought you should be doing something else, or what about this other thing, or did you turn off the stove, or whatever it is, because our minds are very, very busy. So I would imagine that a lot of people, as they practice, notice that it's actually really hard to pay attention to your breath. And it's really easy instead to think about, like, oh, I'm not sitting the right way, I should have done this differently, or whatever. A lot of things come up. But what that practice does is it helps us practice disengaging from that again and again and again. And that disengagement is something that we don't typically do when we're anxious. I mean, we want to, but we don't. Mm-hmm. We don't kind of just let it go. Instead, we kind of fight with it. And so what that skill can help us do is then in a moment of anxiety, so say we're standing in front of a group of people and we notice that our heart starts racing and our palms are sweating and we're thinking this is going to go really badly, we can notice that. We can come back to our breath. We can come back to our intention of why we're there, and we can continue and speak even though we have these uncomfortable sensations.
So this kind of mindfulness can actually help you to build that inner strength that you're going to need to help to start to believe in your own capacity to move beyond these kinds of limits that the anxiety and fear has placed in your life, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's really well said. Exactly. And it gives us, right, a sense that that's a possibility, so even though, I mean, it can sound sort of silly and not relevant, but the experience of practicing and noticing things like you get a cramp in your foot, but you keep going, you stay there. Each of those moments where we have an impulse to get up, to run, to not do something, and we stay, that strengthens our sense that we can stay, mm-hmm. that we can tolerate. If we start thinking, oh, my mind is so busy, I have to stop this, I need to distract, I need to turn on the TV or call someone. Every time we don't do that, then we have this really strong learning experience. I can be with this experience. And then once we can be with it, then exactly as you said, then we can go and we can do the things that matter to us. We can live our lives while this distressing thing is happening.
And if you can sit with it for a while longer and decrease the anxious feelings, then you can start to have that space that you need to put your thought process to it and start to really check out whether the fear is really real or whether it's just imagined, whether you have to do something with it or it's something that you can just go, oh, yes, that scared me, but I'm okay and I can let it go and move on.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. So, right, it allows us, because what happens with anxiety and fear and any of these emotions is they come like commands. They don't come in like a question. It comes in like, no, don't do that. It's bad. But sometimes that is information, and often it's not, right? Because we're going to get that same feeling when we go on a first date and when we go on an interview. And in fact, those are things we want to do. And yet our body's going to say, no, don't do that. And so exactly as you said, when we can be with that uncomfortable feeling, then we have this possibility of saying, actually, I want to do this. And so I'm going to go and do it even though I feel uncomfortable, even though my body or my mind is telling me not to. And so, right, we get that space between the emotion that we feel and the choice we want to make about our action.
So I can really see how practicing this and having a mindfulness type of practice that you continue on a daily basis, it is going to help you when all of these feelings come up so that you want to be able to practice it prior to it being present in your life. Your book is so chock full of step-by-step exercises. So tell us how you think that it not only helps with anxiety, but it actually can benefit other areas of your life too.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's really the same principle. So exactly what we were just talking about. If we have the opportunity to have whatever experience we're having and then make a choice as opposed to sort of reacting, it can help us with all kinds of things. So, for instance, it can help us with things like substance use, right? Because what's happening in substance use? A person may not want to continue to engage in using these substances, but they get a really strong urge, and it's hard to not respond. Mm-hmm. But when you cultivate mindfulness, there's this possibility then of doing what Alan Marlatt, who's done a lot of work in this area, called urge surfing. So of having this like, okay, So there it is. I'm really wanting to do this, and I'm not going to do it, right? But you need a little space to be able to have the experience really strongly and then not do it. Similarly, there's been a lot of research using mindfulness for depression, and particularly recurrent depression, so that mindfulness can really help people notice when they're starting to kind of cycle down into inaction and into rumination and negative thinking, and instead make choices. What are the other things they want to be doing in their lives? How do they want to stay in contact with people? And certainly, there's a lot of evidence that this kind of mindfulness practice can help with just quality of life in general, really paying attention and being aware and being engaged with other people, with the things that matter to us. So it can be a really helpful strategy for a lot of things. And I do want to say, I think sometimes there can start to be a sense of like mindfulness, it helps everything. And I think there's also, a lot of other strategies that can be helpful for people. Certainly, we use mindfulness in conjunction with cognitive behavioral strategies. So it's not like just doing what I just did for 5 minutes makes all this happen, right? It's just that it's a tool that helps then with other things that can help people engage in their lives.
Well, and I'm all for the tools in the toolbox, that the more tools that you can have in the toolbox, the better off that you are going to be. So there are a lot of ways to help with anxiety or other things that are going on for you, but this definitely is a very powerful way to do that. Is there anything that you want to add to this to let people know what they might need to do prior to picking up your book?
Yeah, I would just say sort of a take-home message of being aware of our feelings and kind of leaving room for them, and then also taking the actions that matter to us, even if they make us feel uncomfortable, that those are kind of the two main points of the book. And then the book elaborates a lot more on all of those things.
Okay, and once more, this is a great book. You have a website that they can also go to at www.mindfulwaythroughanxietybook.com.
Yes, and there are downloadable exercises too if people want to do some formal practice and you want to get guided. You want to be guided through them.
Great, and they can also go to Amazon to pick up your book.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. I think this has been very helpful. Maybe we should talk about this more, and I would welcome you back as a guest. I have been talking here with Lizabeth Roemer, and once more, the name of her book is The Mindful Way Through Anxiety. I'll be right back after the break. I'm Kimberly Taylor, and you're listening to KZSB AM 1290. It is perfectly normal to have fears, but do not let those fears hold you back from creating the life that you really want. When we allow our internal beliefs to control us, we stop challenging ourselves to grow and evolve past them. Growth is always a part of the process that to get there, you have to walk through the uncomfortable feelings first. And these are usually the feelings and fears of the unknown. So face your fears. Recognize them for what they are. They are a built-in safety system designed to warn you of possible danger ahead. But then challenge yourself to become more mindful of the feelings and learn when to pay attention to them and get out of the way, and or when to let them go. I want you to be able to learn to move towards your emotions rather than trying to suppress them. Remember, emotions and thoughts are part of being human, and they give us important information that we need to use in our daily lives. So if you have any questions or if you would like to send in an email, you can contact me by going to Dr. Kim at drkimtaylorshow.com. And I also want you to know that there are several ways now that you can tune in. You can go to drkimtaylorshow.com and you can listen live to the program. And, of course, you can hear it here on Thursday afternoons from 2 to 3 p.m. right here at KZSB AM 1290. And if you want to listen to any past shows, you can now find them posted on my website, or you can download them for free as a podcast on iTunes. So I will be here every Thursday afternoon between 2 and 3, and I hope that you're going to be here too. These shows can be heard again in the rebroadcast, Thursdays at 10 p.m. and Sundays at 9 a.m. Meanwhile, have a great week, and until then, be good to yourself. And remember, nobody else has to change in order for you to get better. See you next Thursday.